Welcome back, Camden Catholic. So we're going to pick up today where we left off in class, and we stopped talking, most of us anyway, right around when we talked about Jamestown, Virginia, right? So Jamestown, Virginia, we talked today mostly about how France and England are going to get into this colonizing game, right? So France got in first, and they ranged all the way from Canada all the way down to Louisiana, right on the western side of the Mississippi River. Actually, on like both sides, technically, but on the western side of the Appalachian Mountain chain, right? Now, the first permanent colony by the English, though, was Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Now, there was an earlier colony in 1604, and that was Roanoke, but it actually disappeared, and that was the lost colony. You'll learn more about that when you talk about that in like US 1. But anyway, so the settlers would have never survived without the help of the Native Americans, blah, 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 blah. Like I said, this is stuff that you will go over again in your future classes. A couple things about the help of the Native Americans, though. In 1609, after they established the Jamestown colony from 1609 to 1610, that was known as the starving times because they actually had ran out of food because they didn't know how to farm anything in this environment, and they didn't know how to survive the harsh winters. And so there was even reports of like cannibalism. There's this one woman, if you look her up, her name is Jamestown Jane. It's a woman that actually, there are tool marks on her skull from where they were trying to peel off skin so settlers could eat it. Not while she was alive. She was already dead, so it's not nearly as big of a deal, right? Now, the colony, though, is going to hit a major market in one particular crop, and that is in tobacco, right? Tobacco became a huge cash crop for North America and made the joint stock colony, write that down, Jamestown was a joint stock colony, made it very, very profitable, all right? So tobacco is their major resource. Now, the Pilgrims, a.k.a. the Puritans, write down P-U-R-I-T-A-N, right directly over the top of Pilgrims, because this is all that fifth grade stuff you've talked about 1,000 times before. They were looking for religious freedom. Well, the main motivation was money early on, right? So because the Pilgrims actually didn't show up until 1610, and they're actually the Puritans. So they established the Massachusetts colony, the Plymouth Bay colony, the Massachusetts Bay colony, right? The Pilgrims were English Protestants looking for religious freedom, even though the irony is that nobody really likes the Puritans anyway because they don't like to do anything fun. No drinking, no dancing, no theater, no like liveliness whatsoever. No colors. They must wear only black and white and simple garb. Buckles on their helmets. It's the only, or not the helmets, their hats is the only like flashy thing they could own. So the Pilgrims also survived with the aid of the Native Americans and a strong government established by this thing called the Mayflower Compact. Now, the Mayflower Compact is the very, very first attempt at self-governance by a colony, okay? So, the Mayflower Compact is... Oh, that's a Pilgrim from Coloring Book, yay. The Mayflower Compact was an agreement that set down how to rule the colony of Plymouth. And it appointed a council of, not like elders, but a council that would be used to disseminate problems and different disputes between colonists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the Mayflower Compact was signed by all of the male inhabitants of of the Plymouth colony. So now the English colonies are going to stretch from New York all the way down to Georgia. Actually, even further, they're going to stretch from Massachusetts and Maine all the way down to Georgia, even though Maine was not an original colony. They would grow fast, and the southernmost colonies would grow in wealth very rapidly. They learned how to farm tobacco very well, and they also learned how to farm rice very well in the southern colonies, especially in South Carolina. Now, governing the colonies was a big thing. The colonies would be governed by their European founders, okay? So England would appoint governors, right? Like circle that word, governors. They would appoint governors of each colony, and they were appointed to run the colonies and then report back to the monarchs to let them know how everything was going. Now remember, the colonies were used to make tons and tons of cash, okay? Well, here's the problem. We talked earlier about how the French were over here, and then the English are right there next door. What's going to end up happening? There's going to end up being a massive struggle for power, right? So the struggle for power was actually called the French and Indian War, right? The Europeans are going to dispute over the land and future colonies in the French and Indian War. Now, that started as France and England battled for land in America, and the conflict is actually going to spread all over the world. Technically, the First World War was the French and Indian War because the fighting broke out on their colonies over in Asia and Africa and other places like that. So the fighting is going to occur in Europe, Africa, even India. The British are going to take Canada from the France at the end of the war and boot France completely, pretty much out of Canada, right? It's still going to be part of like French Canada. But anyway, and then later on, we'll end up buying from France the big swath of land right next to the Mississippi River, okay? So the British are going to take Canada from France, and the Treaty of Paris is going to end the conflict to ensure British dominance in North America, right? So, Treaty of Paris, French and Indian War, struggles for power, la 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 la. You'll learn more of it when you get to US 1, in more depth anyway. So, we have to get to the more important thing right now, which is talking about the transatlantic slave trade, okay? So this is something that some of y'all have probably heard a little bit about before, especially in grade school. Now, the Atlantic slave trade is also known as the triangle trade, okay? So make sure you write that down. The Atlantic slave trade, also known as the triangle trade, right? It's called the triangular trade because it was a three-legged international trade network where each leg of the triangle, each leg of that triangle sent different items to each place, making it a complete cyclical system, keeping this trade enforced for hundreds of years. Now, the first leg, all we're going to talk about today is the legs of the trade itself. The first leg, merchant ships are going to bring goods from Europe and Africa, from Europe to Africa, okay? So the Europeans were trading the Africans processed materials, things like guns, cloth, which is textiles, cash, different things like that to the Africans, and then the Africans would give them slaves, right? It is also known as the Middle Passage. Slaves were transported to the Americas from Africa, and slaves were picked up at forts in Africa on the western side coast. Slaves were then transported on really, really big slave vessels that would carry about 500 at a time. And that's known as the Middle Passage because it's the second leg out of three, okay? So anyway, and then the third leg, after the slaves were dropped off in the colonies, they would actually pick up things like sugar, molasses, cotton, rum, tobacco, and other plantation products, also known as raw materials. Make sure you write that down. And then they would carry that back towards Europe, which is where the first leg was, and the whole cycle would start over again, right? Because then those raw materials would be given to the Europeans. The Europeans would put them in factories, process them, and then trade those back to the Africans again. And the whole thing just kept going around and around and around and around. So now this triangular system looks kind of like that, okay? You can take a screenshot of that or something if you have to. The positives, though, it's going to make a ton of money. Cultural diffusion is going to be great in this aspect. International relations are going to peak. It's going to also help establish new countries. But huge negatives, though, is that ships could be lost at sea. A lot of death that's going to come from this. It put a foothold of slavery in the new colonies, and it also promoted racism. Now, we'll get into all of this stuff tomorrow, okay? I know I moved fast. I just didn't want to take up too much time before we got into midterm. So, y'all have a good evening, Camden Catholic. I'll be checking this tomorrow.